Hey guys, I'm just ready to do 2 more videos for you, and this time we're going to get right into the meaty stuff of Nagel. Now I'm just letting you know, I'm recording this at home, so at any point in time I could be interrupted by two awesome children who love to get dad's attention. So if I pause it suddenly, you'll understand why. Okay, so what are we going to do today? Well, we looked at, in previous videos, the fact that perhaps materialist reductionist theories are not able to fully account for the nature of consciousness and what it is. They don't account or have the language or even have the capacity to account for or explain what it's like to have a first-person subjective phenomenal worldview. Okay? Now, we're going to take that claim a little bit further and we're going to see what he really says, which is something along the lines of materialist reductionism doesn't and can't account for the nature of consciousness or how it works or what it's like to be conscious. So, what are we going to try and achieve today? Well, we're going to explore how materialist reductionism can't account for the experience of consciousness from Nagel's point of view. I'm just paraphrasing Nagel, okay? So we're going to recap on some previous theory that we covered in our last class, just so we get a little bit of an introduction into what we're talking about today. Then we're going to conduct a thought experiment, and most of you have a fair idea about what that thought experiment is going to be. And then we're going to derive conclusions about the nature of consciousness by exploring this thought experiment. So can you please write these 3 success criteria down in your book and score each of them, and we'll come back and score them later. Once you've done that, draw me an ABK. Draw me a picture of the senses that an alien might have. And I mean, draw the alien, but if the alien lived in a completely alien environment, perhaps they would sense and know the world differently. So what would that look like? What senses could you imagine they have in the different environment that you've imagined? Thank you. Okay, so when we start off this section, we're going to start off with a bit of an explanation of some of the stuff we attempted to read last time, but it was a bit confusing. This time it should be a bit clearer. So in this reading that I'm going to do a bit later, we're going to say that subjective experience cannot be excluded, right? You can't use a theory that doesn't explain or can't explain subjective experience. You can't exclude it from a theory of mind because we're seeking to account for mind. Okay? Absolutely. So if experience and our phenomenal first-person point of view is part of mind, you can't use a language which has not got the capacity to explain or account for first-person experience. It just doesn't work. It's not adequate enough, I guess. So take a note. So therefore explaining mind using a physical framework is just not possible. It's impossible. Right? You can't explain the first-person account of experience because mental states are tied together with experience, and these mental states are also states that are first-person and based on experience. And matter, when you try and have a material explanation of it, obviously you've got a framework which explains perhaps the brain states and how they work, but it just can't account for the first-person phenomenal subjective states or events that are tied to the material processes that can be observed. They're left out. Take a note. So he's out to explore the difference between subjective and objective knowledge. He's going to do that using a thought experiment. Now this is obviously a thought experiment which is used to illustrate Einstein's theory of special relativity, but you probably have guessed what his thought experiment is. It's got something to do with what it's like to be a bat. Take a note. So what is it like to be a bat? Can we assume that if we want to be that we can actually know what it's like to be a bat? Or, sorry, to ask an even more higher order question, we need to assume that a bat is conscious at some level. Maybe not linguistically like we are, but a bat must have some form of consciousness to some degree. And if our answer to that assumption is yes, we then need to think about a bat's experience. Bats don't know the world like we do, which is primarily through sight and all the other senses. So their subjective experience is based on another sense, which is echolocation. Take a note. It's not at all like a human being's first-person experience. Not at all. So how are we to understand what it's like to be a bat? Can we just imagine that we're a bat? Well, the answer to that question is no, we wouldn't, because we wouldn't actually understand what it's like to be a bat. Instead, we would understand or be able to imagine what it's like to be a human, imagining what it's like to be a bat. In other words, if we put ourselves in the position of being a bat, we would only be able to imagine what it's like for a human to be a bat, not for a bat to be a bat. And we want to know what it's like for a bat to be a bat. Take a note. And this is where we really start alluding to some of the neo-Kantian perspective that we have. I'm just going to go check my dog. I'll take some notes. Sorry about that. A poor couple were walking their little King Charles Spaniel, and of course Willow, the grumpy dog who hasn't been for a walk for a couple of days, is basically taking her frustration out on the dog that was walking past the house. German Shepherds need to be exercised. Anyway, back to this. All right, so as long as we have the structure of a human mind, as long as we have the fundamental structure of the way that a human mind works and it stays the same, we can never fully imagine what it's like to be a bat, right? Or we'll never really know what it's like for a bat to be a bat, right? We can only really imagine what it's like for a human to be a bat. Take a note. Now, some clever people have said, okay, but we'll, never know. But what if we could change and modify our neurophysiology to be just like a bat? Wouldn't be able to know then. And his answer to that is kind of like, well, yeah, but you'd be a bat. Like, how would you then be able to go back and tell your human self, actually, guess what? No, I'm not a bat. Take a note. Sorry, I just need to be a bit clearer. Someone was trying to interrupt me. You can't really go back to yourself when you are a bat and tell your human self, hey, this is what it's like to be a bat, or this is like what it's like for a bat to be a bat, because then obviously you'd be talking back to your human self in a human way. So how do you know? Look, for me, this needs to be read to be better explained. So just keep that in mind for a little bit, okay? But even if we could, as our human self, again, we'd be very far away from being able to understand what it's like to be a bat. Now, sure, the human experience, or the human consciousness, along with the bat consciousness, share some things in common. We can acknowledge that. Both might have an experience of hunger, or an experience of fear, experience of desire, many other things that we would share. And because we are both mammals, of course, there would be many kind of mental states that we'd have in common. But there would be many differences that are just completely not accessible to us. But what about in the case of an alien? Can we completely share our conscious experience, or some elements of our conscious experiences, with an alien? That's a really good point. And at footnote 6, he really starts to point out the reason why he's talked about sharing this is because you can talk about resemblance, but I'm not talking about resemblance. What I'm really talking about is a full, absolute, 100% knowledge or understanding of what it's like for something else to be conscious, right? So in other words, we're dealing with what we call a problem of mind, okay, the problem of other minds, which has been something that's been discussed for a long time in philosophy. He doesn't want us to be able to imagine to a point where we can approximate something. He doesn't want us to be able to say that our material understanding of the way that a brain process works can help us guesstimate what the first person account is like. He wants to say, can we, with 100% certainty, understand the first person phenomenal experience, the subjective experience of that mind. And this is, for other humans as well. It's not just aliens or bats we're talking about. It is a problem for understanding what it's like to be someone else. So take a note, please. So this is what we call the problem of minds, all right? And it was quite clear that if we would struggle to understand what it's like to be a bat or an alien, because we just can't approximate it, then perhaps a bat or an alien would struggle what it's like to be us. Take a note. But what we can't say, because we can have a reasonable guesstimation of it, is that the alien, even though it can't understand the quality of our consciousness, it can't argue, however, that we as humans are not conscious. We have it. But what is it like? We don't know. Take a note. Alright, let me start some reading. While an account of the physical basis of mind must explain many things, this appears to be the most difficult. Obviously, he's talking about consciousness. It is impossible for us to exclude the phenomenological features of experience from a reduction in the same way that one excludes the phenomenal experiences of ordinary substance from a physical or chemical reduction in it, namely by explaining them as effects on minds or of human observers. So what he's basically saying here is that in other situations where you have like a physical or chemical reduction of a phenomena, you could quite easily explain like this is the overall chemical or physical effect. However, he's saying you can't do that. You can't just write off the phenomenological features of experience. You can't do that. Let's see why. If physicalism is to be defended, the phenomenological features must themselves be given a physical account. Now, this is because, I'm going to just tell you now, mind involves subjective phenomenological experience. So if you're going to have a theory about mind, you need to account for phenomenological, subjective, first-person point of view experience, right? However, physicalism can't do that. Just can't. Let's keep reading. But when we examine the subjective character, it seems that such a result is impossible. In other words, we can't do that with physical or materialist reductionist theories. The reason is that every subjective phenomenon is essentially connected with a single point of view, and it seems inevitable that an objective physical theory will abandon that point of view. There we go. Take some notes about this paragraph. It's basically said that the very nature of physical frameworks or physicalism or materialist reductionism cannot really account for that first person subjective character because it's a subjective phenomenon, not an objective phenomenon, and physicalism is based on objective physical theory. Take note. Let me first try to state the issue somewhat more fully than by referring to the relationship between the subjective and the objective, or between poursoy. Remember I mentioned that out before. Poursoy means subjective, and unsoi, which means objective. This is far from easy. Facts about what it's like to be an X are very peculiar, so peculiar that some may be inclined to doubt their reality or the significance of claims about them. To illustrate the connection between subjectivity and a point of view and make it evident the importance of the subjective features, it will help to explore the matter in relation to an example. When he talks about this example, that's when he's getting into the thought experiment, okay? That brings out clearly the divergence, the difference between the two types of conception or phenomena or things, right? The subjective and the objective. I will assume we all believe that bats have experience. So I'm just assuming that they have experience. So I'm assuming that they are conscious. After all, they are mammals, and there is no more doubt that they have experience than that mice or pigeons or whales have experience. I have chosen bats instead of wasps or flounders because if one travels too far down the phylogenetic tree, people gradually shed their faith that there is experience there at all. So what he's saying is that you move further away from the human, then people will start to doubt that there is subjective experience. Is saying it's not really uncontroversial because of their closer relation to us as mammals that they do have consciousness. Bats, although more closely related to us than other species, nevertheless present a range of activity and sensory apparatus so different from ours that the problem I want to pose is exceptionally vivid. So in other words, he's saying the bat's the best example because it's similar enough to say it does have consciousness, but its experience of the world is just so different and divergent to our experience. Okay? Even without the benefit of philosophical reflection, anyone who has spent some time in an enclosed space with an excited bat knows what it is to encounter a fundamentally alien form of life. I chose bats because they seem to be alien. Metaphorically, of course. I have said that the essence of the belief that bats have experience is that there is something that it is like to be a bat. So if bats have experience, then there's something for what it is like to be the bat. Now, and there's that refrain, by the way. I told you that he keeps repeating that sentence. Just note it. Now we know that most bats, the Microphyeta to be precise, perceive the external world primarily by sonar or echolocation, directing the reflection from objects within range of their own rapid, subtly modulated high-frequency shrieks. Their brains are designed to correlate the outgoing impulses with the subsequent echoes, and the information thus acquired enables bats to make precise discrimination of distance, size, shape, motion, and texture comparable to what we make through vision. Okay, that's the way bats' brains work. It basically picks up the sound, uses the information it gets from the sound to make, well, basically to know all that information that he's mentioned before. All right. But bat sonar, though clearly a form of perception, is not similar in its operation to any sense that we possess, and there is no reason to suppose that it is subjectively like anything we can experience or imagine. Stop, take a note. This appears to create difficulties for the notion of what it is like to be a bat. We must consider whether any method will permit us to extrapolate or to unpack to the inner life of the bat from our own case. So as I was saying, look, I don't know if I'm able really to understand what it's like to be the bat, especially from my own point of view. And if not, what alternative methods there may be for understanding the notion. What is it like to be a bat? Our own experience provides the basic material for imagination. In other words, we, as human beings, can imagine what it's like to be a bat, whose range is therefore limited because we use our own experience based on our own senses. It will not help to try to imagine that one has webbing on one's arms which enables one to fly at dusk and dawn, catching insects in one's mouth, that one has very poor vision and perceives the surrounding world by a system of reflected high-frequency sound signals, and that one spends the day hanging upside down by one's feet in the act. He's saying, by imagining that, you're not really going to understand what it's like to be a bat. And so far as I can imagine this, which is not very far, it tells me only what it would like for me, in other words for a human being, to behave as a bat behaves. But that is not the question. I want to know what it is like for a bat to be a bat. Take a note. Yet if I try to imagine this, I am restricted to the resources of my own mind, and those resources are inadequate to the task. I cannot perform it either by imagining additions to my present experience, or by imagining segments gradually subtracted from them, or by imagining some combination of additions, subtractions, and modifications. So what he's saying is not what if we actually modified the brain. So this is where we may have got the argument about, well, what would happen if we changed everything wrong. What he's saying is that, you know, people could not just imagine what it's like to be a bat, but imagine what it would be like to modify. If we could imagine what it's like to be able to modify our physiology, our neurophysiology, then perhaps we can understand what it's like to be a bat. Okay? Difference, that's a nuance that we need to record. Okay? Let's have a look. So he's saying by subtracting, additioning, adding, modifying my parts of my brain or parts of my mind. Okay, to my present experience. To the extent that I could look and behave like a wasp or a bat without changing my fundamental structure, my experiences would not be anything like the experiences of those animals. So even if I could modify my experiences or the things I used to experience, my mind would still have the same fundamental structure. Okay, so we move with that, and if my mind still has the same fundamental structure, I'm still just going to be, even though I've changed those, I imagine that I've changed those things, I'm still going to know what it's like for a human to be a bat. Take a note. On the other hand, it is doubtful that any meaning can be attached to the supposition that I should possess the internal neurophysiological constitution of a bat. Even if I could by gradual degrees be transformed into a bat, nothing in my present constitution allows me to imagine what the experiences of such a feature stage myself, thus metamorphosed, would be like. So what he's saying here goes back to my first description of the idea of modification. And what he's basically saying is, once I've converted myself into the bat, the human being that I am right now wouldn't be able to understand it. I'd have the position of a bat to understand it. So how would I know? How would I know from a human being's point of view what it's like to be a bat? For a bat. Take a note. So even if I could by gradual degrees be transformed into a bat, nothing in my present, that's my human constitution, enables me to imagine what the experience of such a future stage of myself, thus metamorphosed, would be like. The best evidence would come from the experience of bats if only we knew what they were like. So I want to go over this point again. All right, we could imagine by changing and modifying ourselves so that we actually have these features of a bat, what it would be like, but he's saying no, that's still, because the mind still has the same structure, because the mind still has the same fundamental structure, we still are imagining what it's like for a human being to be a bat. Then we could completely, if we could change and transform our neurophysiology so we are exactly like a bat. But obviously, as a human, I couldn't understand what it's like to be the bat that I'm going to be in the future. Take a note. So if extrapolation from our own case is involved in the idea of what it's like to be a bat, the extrapolation must be incompatible. We cannot form more than a schematic conception of what it is like. For example, we may describe ourselves general types of experience on the basis of the animal's structure and behavior. Thus, we describe bat sonar as a form of three-dimensional forward perception. We believe that bats feel some versions of pain, fear, and hunger and lust, and that they have other more familiar types of perception besides sonar. But we believe that these experiences also have, in each case, a specific subjective character, which is beyond our ability to conceive. So what he's saying is, this is the problem of mind. I mean, even though there are similar things that we believe bats have that are similar to what we go through, we still can't understand their first-person subjective character. And I think you could argue that the same could be said about other human beings, though we'd have a much better approximation or understanding of what they go through because we are very close to them. And if there is conscious life elsewhere in the universe, it is likely that some of it will be describable even in the most general experimental terms available to us. So in other words, we'll be able to describe this life using general experimental terms. Hang on, I think I misread that. And if there is conscious life elsewhere in the universe, it is likely that some of it will not be describable even in the most general experiential terms available to us. So we could end up encountering some alien life which just has an experience, but we just cannot imagine what it's like to have that first person subjective point of view. We might have the material object language to understand it, but we don't. So the problem is not confined to exotic cases, however, for it exists between one person and another. Here's the problem of mind, all right? The problem of other minds. The subjective character of the experience of a person deaf and blind from birth is not accessible to me, for example, nor presumably is mine to him. This does not prevent us each from believing that the other's experience has a subjective character. So I don't know what it's like to be that other person, but I can still postulate that they have a subjective character and they have that first-person phenomenal point of view. If anyone is inclined to deny that we can believe in the existence of facts like this, whose exact nature we cannot possibly conceive, he should reflect that in contemplating the bats, we are in much the same position that intelligent bats or Martians would occupy if they tried to form a conception of what it's like to be us. Makes sense. The structure of their own minds might make it impossible for them to succeed, but we know that they would be wrong to conclude that there is not anything precise that it is like to be us, that only certain general types of mental state could be ascribed to us. Perhaps perception and appetite would be concepts common to both of us, perhaps not. We know that they would be wrong to draw such a skeptical conclusion because we know what it is like to be us. And we know that while it includes an enormous amount of variation and complexity, and while we do not possess the vocabulary to describe it adequately, its subjective character is highly specific and in some respects describable in terms that can be understood only by creatures like us. The fact that we cannot expect ever to accommodate in our language a detailed description of a Martian or a bat phenomenology should not lead us to dismiss as meaningless the claim that bats and Martians have experiences fully comparable in richness and detail to our own. So what he's saying is we have the language because we are closer to other human beings in terms of the phenomenal character of our consciousness. We might not have that language to explain the way that a Martian's phenomenal consciousness works, but we cannot, we shouldn't use that lack of understanding or lack of language to understand to conclude that these Martians don't have a rich phenomenological experience, or these bats don't have rich phenomenological experiences. They do. It's just, how will we know what that phenomenological experience is like? It would be fine if someone were to develop concepts and a theory that enabled us to think about these things, but such an understanding may be permanently denied to us by the limits of our nature, and to deny the reality or logical significance of what we can never describe or understand is the crudest form of cognitive dissonance. Alright, we'll leave that a little bit. So, look, that's a lot of theory, but it's pretty easy to understand because we've done the hard work. Alright, the thing I really want to repeat again, though, is this idea of modification. We can imagine ourselves modified, but still with the human structure of mind. But that's still a human being trying to understand what it's like to be a bat. That's not what it's like for a bat to be a bat, okay? Secondly, we could change our neurophysiology completely so that we are exactly like a bat. But if we did that, the human being that we are now cannot understand what it's like to be that future bat. And then if we change ourselves back to a human, we wouldn't really be able to understand what it's like to be the bat, okay, that we once were. So that's really important to understand. So it's about modifying ourselves around ourselves by adding and subtracting or giving things to experience. It will only tell us like for a human to be a bat. And if we actually changed our neurophysiology, if we changed it, the human that we are now or the human that we could be after we were a bat, couldn't really understand what it's like to be a bat because we have a different structure of mind. That's just the way it works. So remember that, make a note. Alright, did we recap on some previous theory? Yeah, we looked at the objective versus subjective. We looked at the inability for materialist language to account for that first person experience, okay? Did we conduct a thought experiment? Yes, we did. That thought experiment was, what is it like for a bat to be a bat? Alright? Did we derive conclusions about the nature of consciousness from this experience? Absolutely. We can postulate that other animals or other beings have consciousness and it's got a subjective first person point of view, but to understand it with a rich phenomenological experience and phenomenological language is virtually impossible. We don't have that theory yet, and materialism just cannot account for or describe those subjective phenomena, okay? And now you know why I got you to draw a picture of an alien. By drawing an alien, you got to think about what is it like for an alien to be an alien, not what is it like for a human to be an alien. Thanks.